from Pontes Books here with the Chapter 28 vocabulary focus for the Prince and the Pauper. Today's vocab word is one that most people are pretty familiar with, but is one that the meaning has changed a little bit over time, but really, I guess it kind of means the same thing, but is still pretty important to some of the events of the chapter. Our word is mob. So we are looking at the word mob, and here is kind of an image of people, if you always, ever see like get your pitchfork. So that's like an angry mob coming after somebody they disagree with. These have been, historically something that people do when they're unhappy about something. But in a modern day context, it doesn't quite look like that, but the mentality is kind of similar still. So what is a mob? A mob is a large and disorderly crowd of people. So you can use the word mob when we're talking about kind of connotations of the word. A mob can describe something like if you go to Disney World and there's just a ton of people and they're all just going different directions and it's kind of chaotic, that could be described as a mob because it's a disorderly, there's not really order to it. But oftentimes, if we look at this word and we think about the meaning behind it, that crowd goes beyond just not being in order. It tends to drift more towards riotous or destructive action. So it depends on the context of the sentence, and it's hopefully something that you can pick up on while you're kind of reading. Is this an angry mob or is this just a chaotic mob? And so sometimes that word angry, that adjective gets added in there just for clarity, but technically that word could be implied with the word itself. So some examples of other synonyms, like I said before, these are kind of not angry versions. These are kind of more positive connotations if you're looking for another word to use that doesn't have that negative feeling associated with it. So a crowd, right? This is a little bit more specific than crowd, but crowd is generally a synonym-ish for mob. A flock, so if you think about animals in particular, that word flock sometimes will be used because usually mob and even crowd are being used to describe people. And then I like this one because this is another one that comes up a lot in classics, is throng. So that word throng is a very common meaning for mob that we see, or is a very common kind of synonym. Some non-examples would be like solitude, that's just like loneliness, you're all by yourself. And then throwing it back to one of our other vocab words, hermit. A hermit hates any sort of crowds or mobs. So that would be someone who is a hermit would not participate in a mob because there's just too many people around, too much going on. They want that solitude. Looking at the etymology of the word, it does come from Latin. So always fun to see how my Latin pronunciation is. Mobile vulgus. Mobile vulgus. That sounds Latin-y. And that directly translates to vacillating crowd. So vacillating means, kind of moving. It can be a literal meaning, or vacillating could mean like indecisive, not being able to make up your mind. But in this case, it's kind of like moving around, and that idea of kind of that chaos, or excitable crowd could be another way to translate that as well. And then that translated specifically, and it seems like was just shortened to mob. So some example sentences. We have our straightforward sentence. After leaving the baseball game, I lost my friend in the mob outside the arena. So based on that sentence, we don't really have enough context to know, is that an angry mob or just like a chaotic mob? But either way, that is one way to use it in a more modern sentence. Here's the example from the chapter. There sat his poor henchman in the degrading stocks, the sport and butt of a dirty mob. So again, we have this adjective here to give us a little bit more information about the mob. And in this case, it could mean literal or figurative, because this is Miles sitting in the stocks after being punished at Hendon Hall, and all of the prisoners were dragged outside to be a part of this crowd to watch him. And then there's also, think, just normal people who are there as well. So they could be dirty because they're prisoners and they haven't had a chance to bathe. Also, just people at Tudor times were also generally filthy if they weren't noble or royal. So they were certainly kind of rowdy, though. Other forms, mob is a verb as well, but with a, slightly different meaning, and whether or not you could, those words are connected, I would imagine that they would be, but there is a verb, mob, and then mobbish. So if you're looking at a crowd and you're describing it as mob-ish, right? It's a kind of mob type crowd. So those two, you do see the verb used often, but I haven't honestly really ever seen mobbish, but apparently it does exist. So that's the word mob. Hopefully you learned something. Have a good rest of your day.